In 1967, the world agreed not to put nuclear weapons in orbit. That was the Outer Space Treaty. Very noble, very Cold War, and very vague. Now, for the first time since then, nations are signing something far more practical. It governs who can land, who can mine, and who gets to build infrastructure on the moon. Today, we're talking about the Artemis Accords and why they may quietly shape the next century. Hello, my name is Gene Botkin. I study space and its growing importance in our daily lives, and I'm building a society for people who want to participate in the new space age. Our topic today is the Artemis Accords and what they mean for the future of international space law. Let's begin. When I first started studying space policy, I assumed the rules were thick, complicated, and aggressively enforced. I discovered instead that most of space law fits into a small stack of Cold War era treaties that politely avoid difficult questions. The Artemis Accords are what happens when those difficult questions finally show up wearing a spacesuit. The story really begins in 1967, at the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on something remarkable. Space would not become another battlefield for nuclear brinkmanship. The result was the Outer Space Treaty. It declared that outer space is the province of all mankind, prohibited national sovereignty claims, and banned weapons of mass destruction in orbit. At the time, this was less about mining rights and more about preventing orbital Armageddon. The superpowers wanted guardrails, not real estate law. So the treaty was drafted in broad, almost poetic language. No nation could claim the moon. Space was for peaceful purposes. Everyone would be responsible for their national activities, including those conducted by private companies. That last part seemed harmless in 1967. There were no private lunar mining firms. There were barely private satellites. Governments launched things. Governments owned things. Governments worried about each other. The problem is that the treaty never anticipated a future where companies would talk about extracting water ice from lunar craters or building commercial habitats in orbit. It did not clarify whether using resources counts as appropriation. It did not explain how to prevent interference when multiple actors operate in the same region. For decades, the ambiguity was manageable because activity was sparse. Space was expensive, rarefied, and mostly symbolic. Now it is becoming busy, and when activity increases, vague language becomes less charming and more problematic. Fast forward half a century. The moon is no longer a Cold War trophy. It is a logistics node. NASA's Artemis program is designed to return humans to the lunar surface and keep them there, not for a quick flag and footprints visit, but for sustained operations. That means habitats, power systems, landing zones, rovers, and eventually the extraction of water ice from permanently shadowed craters near the poles. Water on the moon is not for drinking cocktails with tiny umbrellas. It can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen make rocket fuel. Rocket fuel on the moon changes the economics of moving around cislunar space. Suddenly, the moon becomes a refueling station rather than a distant rock. This shift forced an uncomfortable realization. The Outer Space Treaty says no one can claim the moon. Fine. But if a country builds infrastructure at the lunar South Pole and begins extracting resources, what protects that operation from interference? What prevents two nations from landing uncomfortably close to each other? Negotiating a brand new global treaty through the United Nations would take years and likely produce something so diluted it would satisfy everyone and guide no one. So the United States chose a different route. Instead of waiting for universal agreement, it created a framework for partners willing to go back to the moon together. That framework became the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords were introduced in 2020 as a series of bilateral agreements between the United States and other spacefaring nations. They are not a new treaty in the formal sense. They are a political commitment to follow a shared interpretation of existing space law while conducting lunar exploration together. On the surface, the language is reassuring. Signatories affirm that space activities will be peaceful. They commit to transparency in policies and plans. They agree to register space objects, share scientific data, render assistance to astronauts in distress, and design systems that can work together. Interoperability sounds technical, and it is, but it also signals that these countries expect to build infrastructure that interacts regularly. The provision that attracts the most attention concerns space resources. The Accords state that extracting and using resources from the Moon, Mars, or asteroids does not inherently constitute national appropriation under the Outer Space Treaty. In other words, taking material is not the same as claiming territory. Closely related is the concept of safety zones. These are areas around active operations meant to prevent harmful interference. They are framed as coordination mechanisms, not territorial claims. Still, critics worry that a safety zone could look suspiciously like a de facto boundary if one actor establishes itself early and extensively. These clauses reveal the central purpose of the Accords. They translate broad Cold War principles into rules that can function in a crowded commercial lunar environment. The Artemis Accords were not negotiated through the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. There was no grand diplomatic conference in Vienna with hundreds of delegates arguing over commas. Instead, the United States drafted a framework and invited partners to sign on individually. This approach has advantages. It is faster. It allows like-minded states to align their policies without waiting for universal approval. As of today, more than 30 countries have joined, including traditional U.S. allies such as Japan, Canada, and many European states, along with emerging space nations that see participation as a way to secure a seat at the table. It also has consequences. China and Russia are not signatories. They have instead advanced their own lunar cooperation framework centered on the proposed International Lunar Research Station. That means there are now at least two competing governance visions for activity beyond Earth orbit. Space law is beginning to look less like a single global constitution and more like overlapping spheres of influence. One block organizes around Artemis, another organizes around alternative partnerships. Both reference the same foundational treaties, yet they interpret and operationalize them differently. In practical terms, this means that the rules governing future lunar bases may depend on which coalition builds them, and in space, where infrastructure is expensive and early movers gain advantages, coalition politics can quietly shape the balance of power for decades. It helps to strip away the poetry about exploration and admit something slightly less romantic. The moon matters because it sits at the center of a transportation network. Low Earth orbit is crowded. Geostationary orbit underpins communications and finance. The space between them, often called cislunar space, is becoming strategically relevant. If you can move fuel, cargo, and hardware efficiently through that region, you influence everything from commercial satellite servicing to national security architecture. Lunar water ice is the key variable. Split into hydrogen and oxygen, it becomes propellant. Propellant produced off Earth reduces the need to launch every kilogram from the bottom of a gravity well. That changes cost structures. It also changes strategic leverage. The Artemis Accords quietly establish expectations about how actors behave while building that infrastructure. Transparency provisions reduce the risk of miscalculation. Safety zones create procedures for coordination. Resource extraction language gives investors and agencies legal confidence to proceed. Norms often precede dominance. The first widely accepted interpretation of ambiguous law tends to harden into custom over time. If Artemis signatories build the initial fuel depots, landing pads, and logistics hubs under these rules, those rules may become the default operating system of cislunar space. At that point, the debate will no longer be theoretical. It will be about who shaped the environment before everyone else arrived. It is tempting to treat all of this as distant theater. Astronauts in bulky suits, ceremonial landings, impressive CGI renderings. Yet most people already rely on space infrastructure dozens of times a day without noticing. Your bank transactions are time-stamped by satellites. Your weather forecast depends on orbital sensors. Navigation systems guide aircraft, shipping routes, trucking fleets, and rideshare drivers. Space is not a novelty, it is plumbing. As activity expands beyond low Earth orbit, the legal frameworks that govern that activity will influence which countries build the next layer of infrastructure. If lunar fuel production lowers transportation costs, that advantage will cascade into commercial markets and defense planning alike. The Artemis Accords are an attempt to shape those cascading effects before they begin. They give companies and governments a sense of what is permitted, what is expected, and how disputes should be managed. Predictability attracts investment. Investment builds capacity. Capacity shapes power. If you care about who sets the standards in emerging domains, this is not abstract diplomacy. It is early-stage governance of a future supply chain. And that future will not remain politely distant for long. There is no dramatic signing ceremony etched into popular memory. No powdered wigs, no sweeping declarations carved into stone. The Artemis Accords read like competent policy documents drafted by professionals who prefer clarity over applause. That is precisely why they matter. International law rarely begins with thunder, it begins with practice. A group of states agree to behave in a certain way. They repeat that behavior. Others adopt it. Over time, expectation solidifies into norm, and norm into custom. The Outer Space Treaty established the high-level principles. The Artemis Accords attempt to operationalize them for a world in which private firms launch routinely, satellites are serviced in orbit, and lunar missions are no longer symbolic gestures. If Artemis signatories return to the moon, extract resources, establish safety zones, and coordinate transparently without major conflict, the Accords will look less like a policy experiment and more like a prototype constitution for off-world activity. And if rival blocs entrench competing frameworks, the moon could become the testing ground for parallel legal orders. Either way, the age of vague aspiration is ending. The age of applied space law has begun. If you found this useful, like the video, comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think. Are the Artemis Accords a responsible attempt to bring order to lunar expansion, or the opening move in a new kind of space bloc politics? I read the comments, and I'm always interested in where serious people land on these questions. This has been Gene Botkin with Ellen Arda. End transmission.